Welcome. Today we're looking at an event often presented as the final word on a major Christian debate, the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD.
Right, but it's often told from just one side. This council didn't just settle things, it fundamentally split Christianity.
A huge split, creating that division between the Chalcedonian churches and the Oriental Orthodox or non-Chalcedonian churches that, still exists.
It's a profoundly important schism, and for a long time, the story was largely shaped by those who agreed with Chalcedon.
So today we're going to examine a crucial counter-narrative. We'll be relying heavily on Father V.C. Samuel's book, Council of Chalcedon, a re-examination.
It's a really significant work, and to help us unpack its arguments, we're drawing on the insights from lectures by Dr. Sala Fahmy.
Yes, Dr. Fahmy, president of the West Virginia Academy for Christian Studies. His analysis is invaluable in navigating Samuel's detailed historical and theological points.
Absolutely. So our aim here is to understand how Samuel's book argues for the validity, both historically and theologically, of the non-Chalcedonian position.
To see why they maintain their stance holds true.
Exactly. The core argument we're tracking is that this massive rift wasn't necessarily about fundamental heresy on the non-Chalcedonian side.
But more about other factors.
Yes. Things like intense political pressures, imperial agendas, and, crucially, a deep suspicion around the specific language used at Chalcedon. We need to grasp why this viewpoint endures.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. This crisis didn't just appear in 451, did it? It had deeper roots.
Definitely not overnight. You have to go back really at least a century before Chalcedon. The tension was building between two major centers of Christian thought.
Alexandria and Antioch.
Precisely. Alexandria, strongly associated with St. Cyril, really emphasized the unity of Christ, the divine and human coming together in one single reality.
Their focus was on what's called word-flesh Christology.
That's the term, yes. Ensuring that the word becoming flesh resulted in one subject, one person. Not two acting in concert, but one being.
And they had a key phrase for this.
They did. The defining phrase, which became central for the non-Chalcedonian tradition, was one incarnate nature of the Word of God. Mia physis theo logu syserkomene.
One incarnate nature, stressing that unity after the union took place.
Exactly. One single unified reality after the incarnation. Now contrast that with Antioch.
What was their emphasis?
The Antiochian tradition was very concerned, maybe overly concerned from the Alexandrian view, with maintaining the distinction between the divinity and the humanity.
Protecting the two natures from being blurred.
Right. This led to what critics, especially from Alexandria, termed word-man Christology. And the fear was, it was profound.
What was the specific fear?
They worried that emphasizing the distinctness too much could effectively split Christ into two separate subjects, two sons almost.
Which sounds like Nestorianism.
Exactly, the very thing the church had condemned earlier at the Council of Ephesus in 431. So the Alexandrians saw the Antiochian tendency as potentially reopening that dangerous door.
So it's like they were guarding different boundaries. Alexandria guarding against division, Antioch guarding against confusion.
That's a good way to put it. And this is where the language, the actual terminology, becomes incredibly sensitive, charged even.
Samuel's book talks a lot about this, right? The terms used.
It makes a very strong point here. It stresses that the label often thrown at the non-Chalcedonians monophysite is something they completely reject.
Why the rejection? What does monophysite imply that they disagree with?
Monophysite literally means one nature. It carries the implication, or at least the accusation, that they believed Christ's humanity was somehow swallowed up, absorbed, or eliminated by his divinity.
Which isn't what they were saying.
Not at all. They weren't arguing for one simple nature like divinity alone. They were arguing for one composite or united nature after the incarnation.
So a different emphasis entirely.
Precisely. Their preferred understanding, often described using the term miaphysite, one united nature, highlights this inseparable union. Divinity and humanity together constitute the one Christ, without mixing, without changing, without confusion, but also without any division or separation. One reality.
Okay, so if their theology aimed for consistency with St. Cyril, focusing on this miaphysite union, how did things go so wrong? What led to their condemnation?
Now we get into the really messy part, the politics, and specifically the figure of Pope Dioscorus of Alexandria.
This takes us into the events surrounding Chalcedon itself.
Yes. You have to understand the political climate. Just before Chalcedon in 449 AD, there was the Second Council of Ephesus. The Chalcedonian side later called it the Robber Council, the Latrocinium.
That sounds contentious.
It was very tense. Imperial influence was heavy. But it was Chalcedon, 2 years later in 451, that truly turned the tables against Dioscorus, who was the main champion of the Alexandrian tradition at the time.
And the book argues his removal wasn't primarily theological.
Samuel's argument, based on the records, is that Dioscorus was condemned and exiled after Chalcedon, yes. But not because he taught heresy or deviated from the established Orthodox faith. The book shows he was aligned with Cyril.
Then why?
The condemnation seems rooted in his refusal to accept the new definitions being pushed at Chalcedon, specifically the in two natures formula, and perhaps even more significantly, his perceived defiance of imperial authority and the growing influence of Constantinople and Rome.
So it was about power dynamics, breaking Alexandria's influence.
That's a central part of the argument. Chalcedon provided the opportunity, the mechanism, to sideline the powerful see of Alexandria and its leader.
How does the book support this claim? How does it critique the process at Chalcedon?
It points to major procedural issues. Dioscorus was effectively condemned without a full, fair hearing on the doctrinal charges themselves. The charges shifted. Initially, they were about his conduct at Ephesus II. Then it became about his refusal to appear at Chalcedon when summoned under questionable circumstances,
Suggesting a predetermined outcome.
The text strongly suggests that. It looks much more like a political trial aimed at removing an obstacle than a careful theological deliberation.
Now, you mentioned Ephesus II in 449. There's a particularly controversial detail Samuel discusses regarding that council, isn't there? The blank papers.
Yes, this is a really startling claim found in the source materials Samuel examines.
Tell us about that.
The allegation is that at Ephesus II, some bishops were pressured, maybe even forced, by Dioscorus' supporters or imperial officials present to sign blank sheets of parchment.
Blank sheets, what happened to them?
Later, supposedly, these pre-signed blank sheets were filled in with decrees supporting Dioscorus' positions or condemning his opponents, like Flavian of Constantinople.
That's quite an accusation. How does Samuel connect this to Chalcedon?
The connection is that the condemnation of Dioscorus at Chalcedon was partly justified by his alleged misconduct at Ephesus II. If the proceedings at Ephesus II were themselves based on coercion and potentially falsified documents like these blank papers, then the justification used at Chalcedon becomes deeply problematic.
It potentially undermines the whole judicial basis for acting against Dioscorus later.
Exactly. It suggests the foundation was flawed from the start. Samuel uses this, along with the analysis of the procedures at Chalcedon itself, to build the case that Dioscorus' deposition was fundamentally a political act.
Driven by Rome and Constantinople, backed by imperial power, wanting to curb Alexandria's influence.
That's the picture the book paints. It dramatically reinforces the non-Chalcedonian perspective. Chalcedon wasn't just a theological clarification they disagreed with, it was, in their view, rooted in a judicial and political injustice.
Which makes the resulting schism seem almost inevitable from their standpoint.
Understandable, certainly, if the process itself felt illegitimate to them.
Let's shift back to the core theology then. Because even with the political maneuvering and Dioscorus' removal, a split lasting over 1,500 years needs a deep theological reason, or at least a perceived one. What was the non-Chalcedonian side ultimately defending theologically?
It really does come back to that core Alexandrian principle, the absolute unity of Christ after the incarnation.
The one incarnate nature.
Yes. They insisted Christ is one person, one hypostasis, one reality, formed from or out of two natures, divinity and humanity, which remain distinct within the union but are never separated after the union. No division, no separation into two functional entities.
Okay, so what was the problem with the formula adopted at Chalcedon? The specific wording they objected to?
The sticking point was the phrase, in two nature. Christ acknowledged in two natures.
Why was "in" so problematic for them? It sounds subtle.
It might sound subtle to us now, but in the context of the time, with the memory of Nestorianism still fresh,
It sounded dangerous.
extremely dangerous. For the non-Chalcedonians, saying Christ exists in two natures after the union sounded like you were describing two coexisting, perhaps parallel realities. It seemed to them to reintroduce a duality, a separation, that undermined the unique, singular identity of the incarnate Word.
So they feared it implicitly divided Christ, undid Cyril's work.
That was precisely the fear. They felt it compromised the profound unity achieved in the incarnation. It's not that they denied Christ was fully God and fully man, they absolutely affirmed both.
They just denied you could speak of these two natures as separate operational realities after they had united to form the one Christ.
Exactly. The union was paramount. For them, the proper way to speak, consistent with Cyril, was to say Christ is of or from two natures, ike duo physion, indicating the origin or composition but exists as one nature, mia physis, after the union.
Whereas Chalcedon's in two natures, en duo physesin, sounded to them like preserving a separation they believed the incarnation overcame.
Right. Samuel's work really emphasizes the consistency of the Alexandrian tradition here. They weren't introducing something new. They felt they were defending the established faith, as articulated by Cyril and confirmed at Ephesus first, against a novel and potentially dangerous formula introduced at Chalcedon.
A formula they saw as tainted by Antiochian influence and political expediency.
Correct. The book makes a strong case that the non-Chalcedonian position was theologically coherent and historically grounded in the accepted tradition. Their rejection wasn't of orthodoxy itself, but of specific terminology they genuinely believed was flawed and risked heresy.
This really reframes the whole conflict, doesn't it?
It does. It moves it away from a simple orthodox versus heretics narrative to something much more complex.
It suggests the split wasn't necessarily about whether Christ was truly God and truly man,
which both sides fundamentally agreed on,
but about how to best articulate the mystery of that union without falling into the heresy of dividing Christ, like Nestorius, or the heresy of confusing or mixing his natures, like Eutyches, whom both sides also condemned.
Precisely. And one side, according to Samuel's analysis, used political and imperial power to enforce its preferred articulation, leading the other side, which had legitimate theological and historical reasons for caution, to reject the council.
So reflecting on Samuel's re-examination, guided by Dr. Fahmy's insights, what's the main takeaway for us trying to understand this ancient division?
I think the main contribution is this powerful argument for the historical legitimacy and theological integrity of the non-Chalcedonian stance.
It shifts the focus.
It really does. It compels us to see the schism as being driven, perhaps fundamentally, by factors beyond straightforward doctrinal error. Things like the political machinations surrounding Dioscorus, the institutional rivalries between sees, and this deep, almost visceral suspicion about the specific phrasing, that crucial preposition in.
It suggests the condemnation of the non-Chalcedonians served political ends for Constantinople and Rome, securing their ascendancy over Alexandria.
That's certainly a major thread in Samuel's argument. The theological debate became inseparable from the power struggle.
And what's fascinating is what happened after Chalcedon. Attempts were made to heal the rift, weren't they?
Yes, quite soon after, actually. You had imperial efforts like the Henoticon decree issued by Emperor Zeno around 482 AD.
What was the goal of the Henoticon?
It was an attempt to bring everyone back together. And crucially, it tried to do this by sort of bypassing the controversial Chalcedonian definition.
How did it do that?
It affirmed the faith of Nicaea and Constantinople, strongly affirmed St. Cyril, condemned Nestorius and Eutyches, but it avoided the specific in two natures language of Chalcedon. It focused on the unity, using language much closer to the Alexandrian tradition.
Which leads to a really provocative final thought, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's something Samuel's work implicitly asks you to consider. If, just a few decades after Chalcedon, the imperial authorities themselves felt the need to issue compromise formulas that leaned back towards the non-Chalcedonian understanding of unity to achieve peace,
then how much of that original permanent schism was truly about irreconcilable differences in core faith?
Exactly. Versus how much was about institutional power, the legacy of an arguably unjust condemnation, and disagreements over terminology that were perhaps exacerbated or even solidified by imperial enforcement.
It makes you wonder if history could have gone differently.
It certainly suggests the lines weren't as clear-cut as often presented. The persistence of these ancient churches, holding fast to their understanding through centuries, tells its own story.
Understanding the political heat, the personalities, and the specific linguistic sensitivities of the 5th century really does shed light on why this division remains, and perhaps on the immense challenges still facing those who seek unity today. It wasn't just about doctrine, it was about trust, process, and power.
A complex legacy indeed.
Do you know your simple click makes you a worker with the Lord? You become a spreader of light, a savior of souls, and a seeker of the kingdom. Don't wait. Take action now. Like, share, and subscribe.